Hey everyone, my name is Melissa Massenberg, and I am looking at the book that I chose, which is called Order to Care by Susan M. Reverby. She looks at the nursing history mainly between 1850 and 1945, and of course, just in that time frame and until now too, there's been a lot of changes in the history of nursing. It's important to look at history because, first of all, history repeats itself, and we've seen that in all areas of history. But looking at the nursing history, we can kind of see where we came from and why things are the way they are. We have to understand that there's room for development, and knowing how nursing was developed can help us to understand that. She specifically looked at nursing in the Boston area and surrounding areas, and she did state that there was some stipulation to her research in that she looked a lot at white women in nursing and not cross-cultural, and I know there was a few other books that did look at those areas, but it's important to kind of take that with the information that she received. She said that she is not a nurse, but was really interested in the area of nursing, and I think she did a pretty good job of explaining a lot about the history of nursing, and it really helped me to understand a little bit more about our history and how we've gotten to where we are now. She looked at how nursing went from untrained nurses within the hospital setting to nursing within the hospital program where they did training in the hospital, and then at graduate nurses as well. She looked at class and gender in the nursing story, and nursing was seen as women's work, and men did not do it till much later, so she didn't touch as much as men in nursing. So we look at nursing in our history in a few different ways. First, we look at the pedagogy of nursing, which is how we look at learning and how it shapes our identity, it shapes our thinking, and provides a safe space to explore sensitive topics. We look at history as evidence and how it bears witness and gives us voice, and also dispels myths within our history. And we look at history as an explanation and it gives us content, and explains the present, and provides a way to look forward by looking back. So first I'm going to look at nursing as the pedagogy. So nursing was seen as womanly, mainly only women did nursing, first informally, and most women were the ones that would have to go work within their family or work for neighbors to take care of their sick relatives and friends. So between the 1870s and 1890s, there really was no formal nursing care in the hospitals. There was only in 1873, there was only about 120 hospitals nationally, and most people that went to the hospital were sick, really sick, or poor, or displaced members of the lower working class. If you had any kind of money and were sick, you got nursing in your home, and usually it was a doctor that came and cared for you there, but people didn't go to the hospital like they do now. So in that time, a lot of the nurses that were in the hospital were actually just former patients. So some of the nurses patients that were more mobile would actually be caring for other patients that were less sick or were more sick. And so they looked at hospital nurses as untrained and seen as the dregs of female society. They were too weak, too old, too drunken, too dirty, too stolid, or too bad to do anything else. And that actually came from Florence Nightingale. So she had that same view on hospital nurses. They were usually poor and from working class. And they were like they were a patient, they were the nurse, they were a servant. They did all that in the same time. And many, after they got better from maybe being a patient, a lot of them just lived in the hospital. And they would work from 5 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. and then someone would come in, kind of watch while they got a little bit of rest. But it wasn't trained. It was very unorganized. But obviously someone needed to care for these people, and so there was nurses in that sense that stepped up. Once they started kind of getting training, they had in the hospital training, and they so I'm kind of skipping over to like explanation. A lot of the students would be in there for a couple years. They would work for 10 plus days, or 10 plus hours a day, and then somewhere in there kind of do some lecturing. So it was a lot of on-the-job training. But they kind of used these nursing students as like exploited them for their like unpaid labor. Sometimes they'd give them a little stipend to kind of help them, but they would live in these hospitals for a couple years at a time while they were training, and they were just exhausted. And one thing I found that was interesting was that like within evidence, they measured the danger of diseases based on the high morbidity and mortality rates among the students. So, I mean, obviously this is evidence that we needed PPE even back then, that nursing was dangerous, and, you know, they found that by using pretty much students, and a lot of them either died or ended up leaving because they just felt like the conditions were really bad. There was a lot of nursing strikes in the 1910s by students who were overworked and had harsh conditions, bad food, or assigned to dangerous wards without proper training. The hospitals took advantage of these students, and they realized that there should be better learning conditions instead of being taken advantage of for cheap labor. And so also within a history of explanation, they looked at how, like they were already looking in the 1910s about how to retain graduate nurses. So a lot of these nursing students, once they finished their training, they didn't want to stay in the hospitals because of the conditions. Most of the hospital nurses were thought of as either the nursing students or the untrained nurses. So the graduate nurses usually went into private nursing because they could make more money and it was a lot better conditions. And so they were already, if they were graduate nurses within the hospital, they stayed as supervisors, head nurses, operating room nurses, and outpatient department nurses. So even back when nursing started, they were already looking at retention, because obviously that's still a problem today. So kind of back to the pedagogy. So in the hospital, when some of these nurses were becoming trained, they were told to follow physician orders, keep institutions clean and orderly. That was kind of their role. Which, I mean, I think we do that as nurses now, but I think they took it kind of over the top. They said if nurses violated etiquette, that was looked upon, and a lot of the physicians actually resented nurses that were taken initiative, even when the physicians were at fault. So a lot of times, like, there'd be one or two physicians on call or at the hospital, and they'd all go out to eat. And then the nurses, would, if there was emergencies or there was no physician at the institution, they would be the ones taking the emergencies and taking charge. And some of the physicians felt threatened by their role. And I think some of this was when they were still untrained. And so post the Civil War in 1873 is when they kind of started having these nursing training programs. And the physicians feared that the medical women, and they saw that nurses was a a female intrusion into a male domain. I mean, that was a kind of mixed school of thought, because some physicians obviously realize the importance of nursing within history, and so there was kind of, they went back and forth and if they felt this way or not. So as we look at evidence of the history of nursing, I found a quote that really stood out to me, and it says, "If you love to help others, and if you work with your heart as well as your head and hands, you will have compensation all along the way that will make you forget the weariness and discouragement." And that was on page 29 of this book. And I think that really stands out for nursing as it is today. That quote was actually part of the Massachusetts General Hospital's training school rules in the 1890s. And I feel like this line is why most nurses should become nurses. It is hard work, and some days you do not always feel the reward of being a nurse. But if you truly care for your patients and do everything in your power to do what is best for their care, both physically and mentally, you will know that nursing is the right job for you. So I feel like that's just a good evidence of why these nursing programs were started and why a lot of us have become nurses. So also looking back at the evidence of nursing, so first they were compared to soldiers. They were having the qualities of calmness, self-control, reconciliation to duty, moral order, ethical rules, technical competence, and absolute obedience. So while I think that especially the absolute obedience part maybe a little bit of a stretch, but I think that nurses really are the backbone of the hospital and just the care of these patients. We also look at evidence was shown that there was a need for there to be an organized, trained nursing schools and nurses that could bring moral and technical order to the hospitals. In the 1920s, nurses pushed for decent wages and the desire to help. So there's always that desire to have help to these patients and care for these patients. But there was also, they needed decent wages as well. There was one part of the book that said that the wage rate for nurses was between seamstresses and cooks. So I mean, it was not the highest paying job, and still there is evidence that nursing could be paid more for, especially what we do for the care of these patients and how much we are pushed and pulled for their care, and especially compared to physician wages. But there's still a lot of argument of wages being something that needs to be continued to be looked at for cost of living. But that was kind of, there was a push for that in the 1920s. There was another argument that the state board exam does not determine a good nurse, and I think that still has some evidence today. I think obviously there has to be some kind of standards for nurses when to become licensed and to become able to practice. But I've met some really good nurses that can answer all your questions, but does that translate to the bedside and to their actual care? It's hard to say. And then obviously the argument against nursing school and the nursing questions and what's the best answer, and they're all right, but what's the most right? And a lot of times in a nursing emergency or in real life, I mean, you're going to do all the right things at the same time. They're all right. So it's hard to say that a board exam is a good determinant of a good nurse, but and that was already being argued in the early 20th century, but something else to look for as evidence into nursing history. And then as early as the 1896, there were already nursing organizations started called the Nurses Associated Alumni, the NAA, which was later called the American Nursing Association, the ANA that we know it today. I really felt I learned a lot from this book, and I felt like it gave a lot of evidence and explanation into the nursing history and to how we are today.